And good morning, everybody. This is Nicholas Whitaker from the News Lab at Google. This is our third Google Trends office hour, and I've got a couple of good special guests today, which I'll get into in a minute. But I wanted to just again remind you of our website, g.co/newslab, which is a good resource for journalists or newsrooms that are interested in finding out more information about Google products or in general Google. But also, there's training material and lessons on that site, which will take you through all various different tools that Google has that's useful for storytelling. It will tell you a little bit about the programs that we work with, which Frank is actually a part of, and we'll talk a little bit about some of that stuff later. But then also about Google Trends, which is a very large part of the site and a large part of what we're talking about today. As I mentioned, this is the third session in a series of four. We're going to have another one next Thursday morning. Which is a bit more of a wrap-up and a 101, collecting all additional questions that we might have that we've gathered over the last several weeks. Today we're going into a little bit more detail talking about how to use Google Trends in conjunction with other data visualization tools. And we have our special guest, Frank Pai.
Hi.
Here to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I'm Frank. I'm an editorial engineer at The Verge. It's part of Vox Media. It's a site that covers culture and technology and how they intersect. My role specifically at The Verge is I'm in charge of storytelling, whether that's through making or building interactive graphics or creating alternative story formats, especially for our long-form program. So.
That's great, and hopefully we'll get a chance to take a look at some of those today. Jen, what are we talking about today?
Yeah, today's purpose is really to talk about how we can use Google Trends with other toolkits. I know a lot of people don't just stop and end with what we see at Google Trends, though we have seen people use screenshots and embed our images. But the purpose of this is really to talk about how you can integrate our Google Trends data with other tools, whether it's analytical tools or visualization tools, and just how to up your game.
That's great. And just a reminder to folks, we are live. We have a Q&A app going on the office hour, on the Hangout, both on YouTube and on Google+. So if you have questions or comments, or if you want to just toss some ideas or link to examples of work that you might have done, we'd be happy to take a look at that as well. You can find that via the Q&A app or just add it into the comments section of the YouTube channel. Jen, let's go ahead and get started, and then we'll see what happens with the Q&A.
Yeah, so first thing I wanted to just share with everyone, let me present here. Are you guys able to see my screen?
Yep, looking good.
Cool. So there are a couple things that I'd really recommend if you want to start with one of our data sets. One thing that I would show you guys is if you go to our Explore tool, and if we type in a topic, so let's say Istanbul, one thing that you'll get as you play with our Explore tool and do some research, you'll see this download as CSV appear in the right-hand corner. And this will really let you download an entire report of all of the data that we have here on our Google Trends Explore page. So if you wanted to make your align graphic within your own style rather than using this visual here, or create your own map rather than using our embeddable map here, you'll get a whole report with all of the data on our current site. Another really great tool to leverage rather than just using our Explore tool is if you visit our GitHub, which is at googletrends.github.io/data. And here's just a repository of a lot of different data sets that our team has been able to curate and pull over the last couple months. With the idea here being that our team's really experimenting with the data and trying to figure out the best way to represent a lot of this. But we love the idea of open data and sharing anything that we're working on to see what other people might be able to find as well. So I'd really recommend to leverage either our Explore tool or GitHub to just see an initial version of what our data sets might look like.
And Jen, like a quick question on that, which I'm not sure that we covered in any previous sessions before, but if someone wants to use our trends data, or they go to the GitHub page and they download one of these, what is the requirement for them in order to be able to properly attribute that or reference that?
Yeah, I would source Google Trends for anything that you are using Google data for. In addition to that, on our News Lab, on our training tools for specifically Google Trends, there is one training specifically for how to embed our data and how to attribute our data sources.
That's great.
Cool. Let me stop presenting. So Frank, I'd love to get a sense of, I guess, what type of tools you're often using within your storytelling purposes, and what tools that you can imagine Google Trends working well with.
What tools we use in our storytelling purposes? We have kind of a setup here. As far as like building charts, we have our own system, but I think we use Google Trends a lot to kind of test out our hypothesis. For one example, as part of our entertainment coverage, when House of Cards came out, we were kind of interested in writing about when is it appropriate to start talking about parts of the series, certain spoilers in it. So what we did was we searched through a couple of the characters that pop up later in the season. We saw that search traffic kind of spiked, and since you could get as granular as hourly data, we saw that at certain points when the TV show was released on a Friday, we saw that certain people were searching for it in certain regions on Saturday. We kind of felt appropriate that we could start talking about or tweeting about that point in the TV show. I don't think anything came out of that, but it's always fun to see how that kind of plays out through live Google searches.
That's actually a really interesting use of trends. I mean, in that case, you're using it less as a visualization tool and more as almost as a research tool.
Exactly, yeah. As I said, we have our own kind of visualization setup. Trends is really great for data for us, and I assume for a lot of other organizations. But as a Google trainer, a lot of the smaller organizations love to be able to directly embed some of the graphics, the maps, etc. And just having the raw data, they could do whatever they want with it, which is a great big benefit to everyone.
And Frank, when you're doing trainings and when you're talking to other newsrooms or even just internally at the work that you do, what's the overall thought process around like how to approach trends, or like at what point to roll trends into a workflow? Do you have kind of a scope on that?
Yeah. So part of the training I always say is enter like a data set with a hypothesis, a question to ask, and the search bar in Google Trends is the place to ask it. And usually I have them in the training session to kind of think of something in the news recently and just plop it in and see how it maps out. Some people search for Donald Trump and see the spike in the last 2-3 years, or some people search for. I think I recommend people to search for like flu symptoms because you see the nice spikes every season, etc. But it's really whatever they want to search for. I just ask them to search it into the box and see how the trends try to answer their question.
And as far as visualization tools, and as far as kind of a workflow, for someone who's just kind of getting into using data sets or just getting into using, for example, Google Trends as a data set to approach telling a particular story, do you have any recommendations as far as like how to set up a mindset to approach something like that? Like you mentioned, come to the data set with a hypothesis. Let's tease that out a little bit more and maybe kind of like give somebody some stepping stones to work into that.
Sure. So as a data reporter too, oftentimes someone gets a data set and it lands on your lap. That's one instance, right? And it's always hard to kind of figure out what the story is because you just have this data set, you want to do something with it. So what I always say is have a question, write down a list of questions that you want. You want to interview that data and you want to figure out what you want to know. The other way around is you have an interesting topic, like back to the House of Cards example. We wanted to know when is it appropriate to start talking about some of these spoilers. So we wrote down, we started refining the questions that we wanted to ask. And by plopping that into Google Trends, you would be able to see, it kind of proves through live Google searches. Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, going off of that, there was a really good example that we did recently back in February around the Super Bowl. And I remember just starting off trying to figure out what we wanted to do around the Super Bowl. One of the things that I was hoping for was to kind of answer this question of who is the most loyal fan, and how we could kind of tease out who the most loyal fans were based on the cities where different teams were. And I remember one of the first ways that we tried to answer that data was looking at Google search data and seeing which teams are searching for, or which fans are searching for their teams even when their teams lose. And I realized teasing that out was kind of complicated because we were looking at, I realized that by visualizing that, that's kind of complicated by showing, even if your team wins, you might still be a fan, so you can't automatically just say that because someone's losing, like how do you weight that? And there were all these additional complicated factors. So one of the things our team ended up looking at instead was looking at Google Flights data and saying which team or which fans were searching for flights to the Super Bowl. And that was another nuanced way of teasing it out. And one thing that we had to encounter with that was just how do we attribute fans that might not have to fly out to the Super Bowl and can just drive to the Super Bowl. And so there were all these other ways that we could look at it, but we had to kind of like tease out how we wanted to answer that same question of who is the most loyal fan. And we ended up doing this really great map that showed how people were flying out to the Super Bowl, and ended up saying, I think, the New England Patriots were the second top team searching for, or fan base searching for flights to the Super Bowl.
Yeah, it's interesting too, because like, to me, one of the things I often talk to journalists whenever we're doing trainings around a data set is like I really treat it in the same way that I would treat a person that I was going to be interviewing. You're not quite 100% sure what the story is yet. You're trying to pull the facts out. Sometimes you have to interview multiple people. Recommended that you're able to interview multiple people, and you start piecing together a story that way. You start piecing together kind of a painting of what this particular event or what this particular story might be. Once you start, is there an aha moment at some point where you like, what is that like? When you find that particular piece of information, you're like, oh, this is going to be kind of the path that I can follow in order to get to this particular visualization. Is there like a specific moment there, or is it more of kind of like an ongoing process?
Yeah, for me, I mean, it's asking a lot of the questions and seeing the visualization that pops up. I mean, I'm not even talking about trends, but when you get a big data set and you're able to kind of do a quick visualization, plot it out to see what it looks like, the aha moment is really when you see like a big spike, or you see a consistent a curve somewhere that really you can use that graphic and write the rest of the story around it. That's a really big aha moment. And it may take a dozen questions to get to that, or it may take like 24 different views of the data set that you get. But that's the aha moment that we're always looking forward to.
And Frank, are you coming through just the data set itself, or are you kind of pulling it out and visualizing it and using that visualization as kind of the way to get into that story and to start to tease out whether things are working or not? Is it literally just like looking through the raw spreadsheet, or is it looking at various different visualizations first and then kind of bouncing back and forth?
Yeah, definitely using small visualizations. At Vox, one of the easiest ways to do it, we all use Google Sheets for loading data into our apps. For everything else, it's part of our infrastructure. And making those simple charts, I mean, they're not aesthetically, they're not like, they don't fit within our brand necessarily. It's not something we would publish on our website. But having those load up in less than 10 seconds, highlight 2 rows, and be able to plot it out in whatever chart you want, that's extremely helpful to us.
Yeah, so it's really almost like a pre-visualization tool. Like you're using other like lower weight or lower impact data visualizations to kind of carve out this more complex visualization. Now,
yeah, absolutely.
Once you guys create a visualization, do you ever go back and then like add more to it, or refine it or enhance it after more information comes to light, or is once it's out there, and you just create a new story from there?
Do you mean if we update the story once the initial story publishes?
Yeah, like in an iterative fashion. So like starting something really simple and then making it more complex over time as the story or as the data develops.
Yeah, we haven't done that, but it's always sometimes been part of the discussion, especially for like an ongoing story, maybe part of the election. I'm working on something now that it's being considered for, but the question is, how do we get people to come back to it? And is it like a service kind of thing? I mean, once you publish something, it has like a lifespan. Mm-hmm. How do we get the lifespan back? How do we, bring attention back to it? So our work into this app, updating it, is reflected.
Gotcha. So Jen, as far as like tools that you use on a daily basis, because you guys create a lot of these visualizations, and we put these out, and these are some of the visualizations we were just talking about on the GitHub page and on our site. Like, what is your process when you have this data set, when you have a question, you already have some of those answers formulated. You're looking now to tools that you can use to help visualize this. Like last time we were talking a little bit with Alberto about kind of this process and this care that you put into visualizing things to make sure that it's helping and that it's informing, is not causing more confusion with the viewer than or misleading the viewer in some way. What are some of the thought process that you go into, and then what are some of the tools that you guys, and Frank, I'd open this up to you as well. Like, what specific tools do you actually reach for first to start putting that visualization together?
Yeah, I think from my side, once I first get a data set, I think one of the challenging parts isn't always just the visualization side, but just cleaning and getting the data to a format where you can visualize it. So I feel like often it's the unsexy part of data visualization where you're spending 90% of just data cleansing. But I feel like I spend a lot of time just making a data set in a format where you have nice headers and rows and columns and so on. So I feel like a lot of that work is often done either on Google Spreadsheets or Excel, depending on how manual that effort might be. And sometimes trying to decide if it's worth it to pivot and work in R, which is a programming language, which might be a little bit faster and more efficient for some of our larger data sets. So I think that's one thing that our team is constantly trying to balance out between just doing a manual effort of cleansing a data spreadsheet versus loading it into R and writing out a script for it. And so for anyone that isn't familiar with R, I'd really recommend checking out some of the tutorials on there. There are great tutorials for R on Coursera and other online free classes like Udacity. Our team really leverages both Excel spreadsheets and just kind of manually cleansing out the spreadsheet versus going into R. I think after we get through that rigorous process of cleansing our data set, that's where we really start trying to visualize and just getting a sense of if we do see any patterns. So as Frank mentioned, if we see a spike or if there's a general increase as we had supposed, and seeing whether it really validates the hypothesis that we're looking at. And to do that, I think a lot of our first intuitions are to just do a quick Google chart, whether it's on Excel or Google Spreadsheets, and just seeing if it does validate our hypothesis. And then once we get to that point where we have been able to validate our hypothesis, that's where we really try and figure out how do we visualize this data set, what's the best way to visualize it. So going back to that Super Bowl example, we were seeing spikes for searches to flights after teams were winning the playoffs. But because the data set lended itself so well to geography, we decided we didn't want to just show line graphs for different teams. We wanted to show this beautiful map that would show people flying out to San Francisco for the Super Bowl. And so really having that methodical thought process after you validate the data or validate your hypothesis and say, what is the best way to read this data set and connect with it and understand it?
I was muted. So it looks like there's a couple of different steps there. I mean, we mentioned a couple of these tools for cleaning data. I think Open Refine is another possible option, and there's probably half a dozen other ones that people can get involved with. But I think the first step then, once you've got the data, you've cleaned it up, you've got a couple of different visualization tools that are available to you. We mentioned some of the tools that are built right within Google Trends that you can use. You obviously just embedding those options. If that's not the aesthetic that you're looking for, how does one go about taking the data out of Trends and then putting it in a tool like CartoDB or another type of visualization tool?
Yeah, so I think downloading the data set as a CSV is often one of the best first steps. I think a lot of different third-party sources like R and CartoDB and Fusion Tables will start off with a CSV. So that's kind of like your universal notepad for data. I would really recommend starting with the CSV and then seeing how you can integrate it into a third-party data source or a tool like that.
That's great. And Frank, you've got some experience with Fusion Tables too, don't you?
I do, yeah.
Yeah, tell us a little bit about some of the work that you've done with Fusion Tables and why you would reach for that tool versus, say, R or another like CartoDB or another visualization tool like that.
Sure. Fusion Tables is great. I mean, it's as far as CartoDB wise. I don't think I've used CartoDB, but it's a similar mapping software. And with Fusion Tables, one of the best projects I remember I did was I was at Minnesota Public Radio, and we did a big investigative story on fracking in Minnesota, and we got a lot of different interesting shape files. So the like the highlights on the map. Usually you see shape files in size in shapes of states or counties or zip codes. These were very interesting because it showed kind of where people could frack in Minnesota. It's not a big continuous block. It was very unique shape. And we had a bunch of these shape files handed to us by the state, and it was fast and very easy to kind of just translate that into the KML file that Fusion Tables requires, and we were able to input that into Google Fusion Tables and plop that on a map pretty quickly and kind of refine the styles a little bit. Especially since at the time Minnesota Public Radio, the CMS wasn't built to like handle super custom interactive maps. It was super easy to just grab the embed code and put it into the CMS, and it worked, and we were hit publish pretty quickly.
That's great. And is it pretty much just like as simple as like dropping in an iframe, or like how complicated is that to go from like dropping data in, visualizing it? And actually maybe a second question: how long does that process take? Like let's say you clean your data, you've got it all set up. Once you get it into Fusion Tables, how long does that take? And then from there, how does one then get that into their CMS?
Cleaning the data was probably 70% of the work, 75% of the work. A lot of fact checking, et cetera, that I had to do. But after that, creating the shape files, getting Fusion Tables open, and plotting all the points was probably another 20%, and then just embedding it into the CMS was as easy as just kind of. I believe it's just like a publish. You hit publish, and then you get the tab, and then you copy and paste the code, bring it over to your CMS, drop it in, and you can hit publish. So
that's
pretty
cool.
Pretty quick step, yeah.
And Frank, do you have any visualizations or any projects you wanted to kind of take a look at or show people and walk through?
Sure, yeah. If you give me a second, I'll pull them up and I can share my screen.
Yeah, totally. And while Frank does that, I just wanted to also let people know that on our g.co/newslab site, all the tools that we're talking about that are Google products, so Fusion Tables, Google Earth, Google Maps, Google Trends, obviously we're talking about that today. There's tutorials and training opportunities on the site for those tools. And those trainings actually go quite a bit beyond just how to use the tools. We have a set of 11 training tutorials around verification and fact checking. So in the same kind of vein of asking or interrogating the data sets, getting information from them to help tell that story, you can also use these data sets, and you can use some of these tools as ways to kind of verify or vet other news pieces that have come out to see, like, did that particular news story happen in that location at that time as that particular story told. We've got this really great organization called First Draft Coalition that has helped put together a lot of these training materials. You can find out more about them as well on our site. But if anybody ever has questions on any of those tools, you can always reach out to us either through Twitter or our Google Plus page or our YouTube page, or you can just reach out via email at newslabsupport@google.com. We also love taking a look at examples as well of how people have used these tools in the media. So I guess the overall statement here is don't be a stranger. Stay in touch with us. Let us know what you're working on. And we'll obviously have additional office hours as time goes on. And those questions that you guys send us are actually really, really helpful. And actually, we just got a question coming in a little bit ago that I wanted to address. Mark Ham Nolan asked a question that we get quite a bit, actually, and this, Jen, is for you. It's actually a little bit around like that index, and I think there's constantly a little bit of confusion around what that index is and what those numbers represent. But Mark was asking, he says, hey, will you be adding number of searches to the CSV data at any point soon rather than just the 1 to 100 index data? And let's just kind of talk a little bit about that index data and what it specifically he's talking about, and then we'll kind of go into that, and then we'll flip over to Frank.
Yeah, so yeah, I can start off with just explaining that index first and what that really means. Let me see if I still have our site up. Might be easiest to explain with that visual aid there. There you go. So if we go back to our Istanbul example and pull this up, when you first pull up Google Trends, you'll see a line graph showing search interest in Istanbul over time since 2004, and as you hover over, you'll see search interest with this number beside it, which goes from 0 to 100, and you can see this 100 point here in January 2016. The idea of what we're doing here is that for every single time point on this line graph, we're taking search interest in Istanbul as a proportion of all searches on Google during that time. And in this case, we're looking at worldwide searches since 2004. The reason that we normalize our data in this way is that it allows us to really make sure that we're able to compare different times or also different locations. The idea is that we've had more search interests on or searches on Google now than we did in 2004, and so it would really be hard to do any research with a lot of this data if we were to show raw number of searches rather than our normalized data in this way. Because if we did show our raw numbers, you'd see this gradual increase, which would more along the line show just people on Google rather than people interested in a certain topic that you might be researching. So after we normalize our data, we set whichever time point has the highest search interest, so in this case, January 2016, and we set that value to 100, and we index all of our data to that value. One of the reasons we found this really powerful is essentially what we mentioned about normalizing our data, and just that by representing our data in this way, we're really able to make sure that we're accurately able to compare different locations and different times without letting Google activity kind of bias or misrepresent any of our how people's intrinsic interests might be at that time.
So just one thing I just wanted to pull out of that. You mentioned like over time, the search interest in general increases, or the amount of people that are using search increases over time. I just wanted to make sure was that what actually you were saying?
Well, what I meant was that the number of searches on Google have increased in 2016 versus in 2004, and so we don't want to be saying that Istanbul searches have increased just because there are more searches on Google now than there were in 2004. So rather, we look at the percentage of searches for Istanbul over all searches on Google at the given time or location. So by looking at that proportion and how we call it our normalized data set, then we can really be able to tease out whether searches for Istanbul are whether interest in Istanbul is higher than now than in 2004.
So that normalization that we're talking about is really kind of taking into account the change over time that would just organically occur because of more access to the internet, more people using search, those types of things, balancing that out so that you actually get more of an accurate reading for any particular time or location. Is that accurate?
Yeah, definitely. One really interesting example that I've seen before is if you just look at search interest in mathematics, you can see, actually, maybe it was science. So science. You can see this gradual decrease in search interest for science since 2004. And part of the reason for this is just the people who are searching now in 2016, that community is a lot more diverse than in 2004, where people might have been searching for just academic reasons or research reasons. Now you can search for cat videos or things of that sort. And so as a proportion of all searches on Google, you can see these differences over time rather than just an increase, because as you mentioned, that organic increase in people looking or searching on Google.
The thing that makes me wonder with like those dips over time, they seem pretty repetitive. I mean, is this a seasonal effect that we're taking a look at here, where it's got that kind of sawtooth effect?
Yeah, what's really cool about this is you can kind of see very much that it matches with school season. So you can see in July there's less interest in the summertime when people aren't in school. You can see this jump in September and then a drop again in around winter break in December. And so this is another seasonal change that it would be hard to represent if we were just showing raw number of searches, because you would instead what we want to show is seasonal interest in science rather than bias that by looking at the seasonal changes just for people searching on Google as a whole.
Yeah, so one other question that we're talking a little bit about bias and talking a little bit about how what kind of information we're pulling out of a particular story. If I'm looking at this, the first thing when this pulled up and we started talking about the overall decline over time, like my first thought was like, gosh, that's really depressing. Like, way fewer people are interested in science, now than they were in 2004. But that's probably not the case, because I think the data itself as you were talking about, like the demographic of who's searching for data or around science, or a search term like science is changing, and the access or awareness to that particular information. I think another one that we were looking at recently was the term transgender, and how that's changed over time. That term is way more readily available in the public discourse and in media now. So, somebody has a higher likelihood of going online and searching for that term because it's already in their consciousness. Within a visualization like this, I think one of the risks that a journalist runs is to just take at face value what this visualization might show and infer things from that without asking it further questions. Like and this is a very long-winded question, but Jen, and Frank even, how would you take a look at a data set like this or a visualization like this, and then either ask or tease out additional questions from it to make sure that what you're seeing is actually representing a particular narrative, or like how do you safeguard against kind of that type of bias that we were just mentioning?
Yeah, I think on our end, it's always great to run comparisons. So earlier we brought up mathematics, teasing out whether the trend is there by doing a comparison between science or math. One other thing is just thinking about like the overall context of our data. So right now we're just looking at 2004 to present, but teasing out what it might look like just over the school year, or what it might look like in different areas around the world where school times might differ. So I think teasing out those specific factors and seeing if those patterns still hold true is one thing that we're constantly looking at to test our hypotheses and the different things that we're exploring and researching on trends.
Yeah, for us, the same thing, or we would go interview someone and ask them and make them see, look at the trends, look at the chart, and ask them questions about and hit them with our hypothesis, either if it's science is spiking because of the school year, etc., and we get some background from a human to add to it. So
I think that's one of the important points too. Is this human interaction. It's like the data is great, no doubt. We're looking at the way people are searching for things online, but to corroborate that or to correlate that with other things, I think is really important. Frank, did you manage to pull up the visualization?
I did, yeah, I did. And cool. I was actually just looking up this, I forgot, but it's in my examples for Google trainers in my slides, but there's this website where they match up different correlations just randomly, and it's like
Google Trends correlate?
It's with, I'm not sure, I think they use Google Trends, but they put up like two random things together. And it's like Nicolas Cage movies and people who die on bicycles every year. And the more Nicolas Cage movies that are made, the more people unfortunately die. And if you see these charts, they're exactly the same lines plotted over time, but they're not correlated whatsoever. So,
yeah. And I think that's a really, really important point to be making. Like, just because they correlate doesn't mean there is actually a correlation. There's a lot of potential just randomness, I think, there.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to share my screen. I'll share the entire screen. You guys see it?
Yep.
Okay. So this is one. Oh, I want to show you guys the fracking story that I talked about earlier. So this was in 2013. More than 20 proposed frac sand facilities. So these are the orange kind of are the unique shapefiles that we got from the government. And it was just easy to kind of upload into Fusion tables and get it in here. And the dots were showing the proposed frac sand facilities. So I had to call every single facility to kind of confirm that they were actually there. The data was kind of not great, but it's kind of really easy to use Fusion tables here because you have the map and with the highways, etc., and kind of a general relative location there already. So that was really good. Best case for that visualization. To the contrary, I made this last year with the headline, "Poverty More Than Geography Determines Who Gets Online in America." It was just part of a White House report that we got that showed how poverty level affects the type of internet that you get. And the map that we got here, because this was all based on county, we just made our own custom map with all the counties, and we bucketed the numbers, and you can kind of see like there's a tooltip with the actual data that comes out, and you can see kind of how the number the colors are darker in these major cities over here on the East Coast, etc. We didn't really need to use kind of like the highways and all that stuff, but it was kind of imperative for the frac sand map. Another one, this is drone exemptions over time. I did this big report on drone licenses. So this was last year, this was a year ago. Things have changed a lot, but in order to fly a drone for commercial purposes to get paid, you had to file for a 333 exemption with the FAA. And we had updating data. We were partnered with a college. There's actually a drone college at Verge school. And they had a couple of student researchers go through a bunch of PDFs and write down a bunch of PDFs of the license exemptions and write down what kind of purpose they're using their drones for, when they applied for, where they were, etc. So we had those data. We had that data update every 2 months, and we made this chart that kind of updated itself every time the data got updated. So you can see agriculture, conservation. This is by month. Construction, education, and kind of similar to how Google Trends has the repo for data, we have one similar at Vox Media for data projects. So our drones data is all in here too as a CSV. We all use CSV, it's pretty standard, along with the internet map that I showed you guys earlier. And here's one more map that I wanted to show you guys. This one I actually didn't work on, but this is with the headline, "The Worst Company in America, Comcast." This is before and after the merger, how Comcast is kind of taking over. So,
and there I am, right in the middle of Denver there. If you could actually go back, Frank, I wanted to just take a look at that fracking example that we were talking about earlier. We were talking about shapefiles earlier, and there's a couple of interesting things going on here, I think. I mean, first of all, like as you mentioned earlier, when we get shapefiles in, it's often like a state or a county or some sort of like border-oriented shapefile. What would you suppose, like this particular data set, because it's so kind of like stringy and kind of spread over time, are these points on a map that have been clustered, or like what are these shapefiles that we're looking at here, do you think?
I think they are polygons.
Okay.
I remember, yeah. I had to take the shapefiles and convert them to KML in the middle. There's an easy tool called Shape Escape, just a website. You upload it and it gives you the file that you need to load it onto Google Fusion Tables.
Yeah, this one would be really interesting to see in relationship to elevation. I'm wondering if like the shape of those particular polygons have anything to do with the geometry of that particular location.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I don't think we asked that question. We should have.
Yeah, because it looks like it's kind of like in the valley areas between ridges there. Another question too, with this particular visualization, we're talking about how like this, as compared to the next one I think that you showed, like you kept in highways and other types of like location data in here. I think that this kind of speaks to a little bit about the question of the purpose of this particular visualization as opposed to the next one, where this one's more, it's very location-based. I think the story here is the proximity of these fracking sites in relationship to other cities or other locations. And as a reader or as a viewer, that would probably be the main concern, yeah? The next one over, which I think was it the poverty map, I think was the one that you were showing. So this one, we're looking at counties still. But I think that the story here, it's more of like an aggregate, right? So we're seeing like these large swaths of kind of poverty-stricken regions of the United States that pretty clearly don't have good access to internet, and then we have like these other, more focused areas on the east and west coasts. Was that the goal here? Was just to kind of show, and even just in the color treatment, to kind of show like the stark difference here, or what was the choice that was being made to get rid of highways and things like that?
Yeah, I mean highways and the stuff in the frac sand. I mean that's just another layer of data, and we didn't need to show that layer of data necessarily here. But with here, we just wanted to show how in the United States how the data differs by geography, and you could kind of see it through this map. But yeah, I mean, it's we can show as much data as we want. We can show the mountains, we can show everything, but it's just a choice visually to show just show what you want the users to see. And I think the highways or anything else would have been distracting or confusing for the rest of this kind of angle here.
Yeah, and I think that's the key here is like when you're visualizing this type of data, when you're taking advantage of this type of map, it's you don't want to confuse or further complicate that particular conversation. So you had two other maps. I just wanted to take a look really quick. I think one was Comcast, and there was another one that was one other one. Yeah. So this one again, did you pull in a shape file for like access to where Comcast was, or what regions that they were alive in here, or what was that? What were those layers that we're taking a look at here?
Yeah, these are definitely unique shape files that we got from a source. I didn't work on this project, but by the looks of it, this is clearly shape files of some sort, pulled from somewhere. It might have been a FOIA or somewhere else, but it's markedly similar to kind of the FracSAN, the shape files from the FracSAN in that way.
Got it. Now, Jen, do we ever, like when we're doing visualizations, when we're putting things together, like do we ever pull in other data sets and other types of files to kind of overlay over top of Trends data, or have we seen people that are doing that out there in the industry where they're taking Google Trends data, overlaying that as another layer over top or in conjunction with another data set that they've combed and then drawing those correlations and those kind of conclusions based on that?
Yeah, there's one interesting idea or one interesting trend that comes to mind for something that we've done. One of the things that we did recently, or I think about a year ago actually, was developing a Sparkle map for searches around. I forget. I think it was Hurricane Sandy at the time. So we looked at searches for Hurricane Sandy by day on the East Coast. But what was interesting about it was we also mapped the longitude and latitude of Hurricane Sandy as it progressed, so we could actually see the movement of search interest as Hurricane Sandy moved around. So that was a really interesting case of seeing how real-world events kind of affected where people were searching and who was most concerned about a real event going on at the time.
And we've seen a couple of other examples like that too. I think like the Tibetan earthquake. We saw some activity, where people were searching for how to help during that particular crisis. I think we've also seen in the past, like during MH17 and MH370, like these very location-based searches. Correct me if I'm wrong, but like you typically see like one or two or three different type of phenomenon. Either as that story shifts and as that search for a plane, for example, shifts to different locations, the search interest around those regions shift as well. Or as like people wake up in different time zones, you'll see search interest pick up because they wake up, they hear about the news, they go online, they do a search for it. And do you see that happening pretty regularly, where there's like kind of like this wave phenomena of like chasing a story or chasing time zones?
Yeah, we definitely see like that differing time zone as the news comes to different regions. So one example that comes to mind is this this visualization that we did recently that we talked about with Alberto Cairo last week about the first minute that people were searching for the Paris attacks. And you could see this gradual shift for the first minute. And a lot of it was just location-based. And as the news and airwaves were coming to different regions and how people were hearing about it. Another phenomenon that we often see with our maps as far as time and location might go is just once people hear the news, like how that news explodes online. So one thing that we've seen with our Sparkle maps around the Zika virus, for example, you could see searches for those symptoms kind of just within Latin America, and how as the news has kind of become more widespread around Zika, how it's just kind of exploded. We've seen similar things with Ebola and other large news stories like that. And so that's another example of that. Instead of just seeing this regional change, just an explosion of searches on Google.
So you mentioned a Sparkle map, and then we're also talking a little bit about like other types of visualization techniques that you can use to visualize something like that. Like beyond just shape files, like with what we were showing with Frank, with some of these like we're taking a look at a large region or a large span of space and showing over that particular space, how that particular region is being affected. And in the case that we're looking at access to internet, or we're looking at like fracking sites. I've seen other income data or census data pulled in to kind of visualize things like that. I think we had actually a really good one that we were doing with Google Trends that was showing like Thanksgiving recipes across the United States. Those weren't shapefiles that we were using. We were just kind of using each individual state and pulling some keywords for each one of those. But what are some other, like, if you have a phenomenon that's like, let's say, an earthquake that's happening in a particular location, you're seeing over time how search around the world is changing. What are some ways to visualize that, to really capture that element and kind of show that human kind of factor that's going on with the way that people are searching?
Yeah, I think at the simplistic end of it, we first just start off with what the searches themselves are and just getting a sense of how people might be searching for these human event stories. So just what people are most curious about in the moments after a lot of these different events, whether it's an event like the Olympics or an event like an earthquake or an attack, and just getting a sense and orienting ourselves around how people are responding. I think after that, what we often do is once we get an understanding of how people are responding to an event, we try and understand how things might have changed over time and also over a location. So the first thing we might look at is for specific searches, how it might have changed over time. So if there were specific spikes or if there's been dropped search interest in a phenomena. And then the next way is by looking at it by geography. So just if there are certain areas that might have more interest than other areas. The really interesting thing is when we combine both of these together, so by time and by location, so getting this visualization of how things are changing over time, whether it's that phenomena that we mentioned where regionally people are shifting interest, or if it's the phenomena where everyone all of a sudden becomes super interested in a topic over time. One really fun thing that we did a while back ago was just we did a sparkle map for search interest in burritos just to see if burritos are more popular now than they were in 2004. And so we just did a sparkle map to see if first we saw that there were more increased searches, I believe, for burritos, but we also just wanted to see like where burritos are trendy now and getting that sense of when the U.S. really started to eat burritos.
So where is the place to go get burritos now?
I would definitely say San Francisco.
You might be a little bit biased on that. So as far as process goes, Frank, is that pretty kind of similar to the thought process around different types of visualizations that you would use? Like, we were talking specifically about some of the examples that you use that were shape files and pulling in data like that. I think that Jim makes a really interesting point. Like, the human element, we all have this kind of shared experience of time. So to be able to frame or give context to a story, I think time's a really great way of doing that. Like, are there other techniques or other kind of data points that you'll look to help kind of pull that human element in?
Yeah, I mean, it always depends on what kind of story we're trying to tell. But I'd say time is a big factor if we need to use it, if that's part of the story that we want to tell. But when we usually get a data set, we clean it up, take a look at all the different slices that we can from the data that we have. Sometimes it's limited, sometimes it's infinite. And if it's infinite, it's a lot of work. We have a lot of different options. It's always tough to figure out, do we want to tell it over time? Do we want to tell it over a different method? But time is always one that we always consider. And it depends on what the writing is about too, or what the angle is. Everything is up in the air. So.
Yeah, beyond time, like what are some other, just for someone that might not have a ton of experience asking these kind of questions, like what are some other factors that you might take into account beyond just time?
We might do some pullouts of like a big map, like the poverty map I showed you. Another way we could have done it is we could have highlighted a couple regions. Mm-hmm. We could have cut down into a couple of metros. Showed you that instead and kind of dive deeper into those areas. Maybe we could have got them in zip codes or neighborhoods or something like that, go more granular that way. That's another example that has been considered, and it depends on time and resources, deadlines, etc. And we have to fall back on something. But in a perfect world, we get a lot of time to work on it, and it'd be a huge project, and we'd be able to see everything, and everybody would be able to see all the data. But unfortunately, in a deadline-driven world, that's how it goes.
Frank, I'd love to get a sense of, you mentioned earlier that you're often spending about 75% of your time dealing with just cleansing the data. You brought that up for the fracking data set that you were calling different places. I feel like that's one thing that a lot of people don't often talk about like the messy side of data sets and what it's like to just cleanse a data set before you get to the fun part of actually seeing where all your hard work has gone. I'd love to get a sense of like what tips you might have as far as cleansing the data and what tools you might use, since that's I think that's often an aspect that we often don't talk about.
Yeah, and to be honest, I wish my bosses knew how much time I spend on cleaning the data too. But I mean, it's a huge process. I mean, you can't really do anything without the data. Sometimes it falls on your lap, like I've mentioned before. But when you want to write the good story, when you have a hypothesis, a really good one, you have to get the data yourself. Cleaning the data, or even like scraping it or collecting it together, is the bulk of the work. I use a lot of I use Python to clean everything up. Right? Or if it's a small enough data set or something that fits in a Google Sheet or something else, just writing a few statements to clean it through is good enough. Or we have sometimes you have some help from interns to able to go through them with some fresh eyes and to be able to kind of like bulletproof it from a different set of eyes. That really helps. But as far as process, it's a lot of scripting. It's a lot of time looking through the same spreadsheet multiple times to make sure everything's set. And even then, you might not be able to get it right.
And so, Frank, you mentioned, well, first of all, the interns are definitely the best cleaning tool that's available. But I'm extrapolating that. But what other tools? You mentioned scraping tools. Do you have specific tools that you reach for to scrape data? Like, let's maybe talk a little bit about what scraping data means, just for people that might not be initiated in that.
Sure, scraping data. So the goal is to have data that's in a structured format. So CSV is the perfect example of a structured format. It's comma-separated values. All the things are neatly aligned between in columns after they figure out where the commas are, etc. But to get there, sometimes you don't have that data in that format already. They're scattered all over the internet, or they're on 30 or 40 or 100 pages on the internet on some website, and they're just there, but you'd either have to go through every single page and copy and paste every line, copy and paste it yourself into Google Sheet, or have your intern do it. But even then, you introduce the human element and the human error that has to be factored in when you do that. It also takes time. It takes many, many, many hours. So what I often like doing is creating a simple. There are other programs that you can do online if you don't know how to program to scrape data, but I'm pretty good at Python. I use a library called Beautiful Soup. And you write a couple lines of code. You tell what pages you want it to kind of go through. If the data is in the same place, like names here, titles here, data unit, like the price is here, you can tell the computer to kind of automatically go through all those 100 pages and pick out the same data point in all 100 pages. And writing the code maybe takes 20 to an hour to maybe a few hours if it's a really hard web page. But it saves you a lot of time and makes sure your data is in a structured format, and it's almost always error-proof.
That's amazing. Yeah, for a non-spreadsheet kind of oriented person, like I did most of my work in video production, and photography. So like I just didn't have experience with spreadsheets. And when I started getting into some of this stuff, it was like, oh, you don't have to manually copy and paste this stuff. And like, oh my God, there's like formulas that you can do between these. And like for me, that was kind of revolutionary. But we're talking about like next level things here, where if we're taking like hundreds of pages, like there's so much manual error, as you were mentioning, that could be involved in like copy pasting or manually doing that. And there's just frankly not enough time to do any of that. The whole idea behind this particular office hour is really talking about like using other tools with data sets. But as this conversation has kind of evolved, it seems like what we're talking about really is there's a lot of steps that go into like just getting the data into a format that you can then push into a visualization tool and create a story with. Are there any other elements there? Like there's finding the data set, there's scraping the data set, there's cleaning the data set, there's organizing it in a way that's useful, there's asking it questions to make sure that you've got the relevant information and you're telling the right story. You have a couple different tools that are available to you, either if you're using trends data, there's the trends visualizer itself, there's taking that data, downloading it, using another visualization tool. What's missing in that process there? Like what else are we not talking about there?
I think I would add like user testing to one part of it. We want to do this more for some of our products, but sometimes when you're so invested in the project yourself, and you want to show something to someone, I mean, this is like the angle that I want to show through my visualization. sometimes you get too into it or you're too invested in an idea. So when we do have time for visualizations, we try to bring in a few people that aren't stakeholders that haven't seen it before and put it down in front of them, give them like 10 minutes and have them tell you what they think I'm trying to show. And the times we've had time to do that, it's been very, very helpful.
And I imagine too, like if those times that you don't have time to do that, your audience will probably tell you pretty quickly too, like whether that's probably working or not, or like the analytic data on that particular piece will probably tell you as well.
Absolutely, yeah.
So, like, let's say, and Jen, if you have any other, actually, Jen, do you have any other elements here? Like, what I know you deal with this stuff day in, day out. Like, what other pieces are missing in this puzzle?
Yeah, I think I definitely echo what Frank said as far as just getting people, getting what you've made in front of as many eyeballs as possible. Within our team, whenever we're making a data visualization or have found an insight, we share it across our team and really tried to get as many different people to look at it to get a sense of if we are answering the question that we initially posed accurately with our data set. And just getting a sense of if our data is understandable or if our visualization does make sense when you first look at it, or if it can be confusing or if it misses the ball. So I think sharing as much as possible. Another thing that you kind of mentioned earlier was when you do build something, share it back with us at Google Trends. So if you find something on our GitHub that's interesting to you and you play around with it, definitely sharing with us and letting us know because it might have even been something that we can help along the lines with. So one thing that we actually came across was a horse race that utilized some of our data from GitHub. So for anyone who's seen some of our elections horse races that look at different candidates throughout the course of debates, that horse race was first conceptualized by someone who came across our GitHub, decided to build out a horse race because they thought it would be interesting, and then shared the code with us. So just sharing within the community is always a huge factor to build up the data journalism and data visualization community because it just makes it stronger.
Yeah, and I think part of that too is like you don't always have to reinvent the wheel, right? Mm-hmm. Like there's other tools out there, there's other visualizations that people have done. In a lot of cases, that information is available on GitHub. You can download that, and you can use as an example, change the story or the topic, but use the same visualization technique. In this case, we were talking about a horse race tool, which is really just showing over time like how particular candidates or how particular search terms are changing minute by minute in comparison to one another. Yeah, so like if you don't know how to do that, it's not the end of the world. Like you can go to GitHub, you can go to other locations and find this stuff. Which brings me to like maybe one last question, and then Frank, I want to give people an opportunity to learn where they can find out more information about the work that you do. But once you have this visualization, you've put this in your story, you've sent that out into the world, then what? Like, what happens after that? Frank, you were mentioning there's a little bit of a half-life with stories, and it doesn't always, it's not always worthwhile to go back and edit that particular visualization. Do you use those visualizations in some way? I mean, I imagine there's like this kind of library in your head as far as like what's worked in the past and what hasn't. Are you going back and looking at the analytics and taking a look at and seeing like the success of that particular data set? Like, what happens to that once it's out there in the world?
Yeah, I mean, we look at analytics for all our stories, all our features, etc. We track the clicks, etc. on the interactives as well, and we use that. We look at those and factor that in to see what's doing well, what's not doing well. We read all our comments too, whether it's on Twitter or in the story, for any recommendations to make it better next time. That definitely has a factor in, but we try not to take all the page views and the clicks and try to make it to get more clicks next time necessarily. Just general improvements on how you get better at that kind of storytelling.
Yeah, it's just refining the technique and refining the quality of that particular work, not chasing clicks.
Right.
I just wanted to add to that. One thing that we often have to stay rigorous with Google Trends is a lot of our data might, a lot of the stories that we've worked on previously are constantly updating. So looking at search interest for Donald Trump versus Hillary Clinton by day, that's something that we are constantly trying to update different visualizations for by as we get more data and as the election season progresses. So that's one way that our team constantly tries to go back and just update our previous visualizations to make sure that our data doesn't get stale and it doesn't miss big events that might be upcoming, such as the conventions or future debates.
Yeah, and Frank, you actually mentioned that too when you were talking a little bit about the drone piece that you're talking about, and you're getting signed up for those exemptions. That piece is dynamic over time. So how do you set that up so that if you have a data set that is going to change over time, that particular data visualization doesn't instantly become stale once that data changes?
Yeah, that's a good question. So we've tried to write smaller posts from that. Every single time we get a new update, the drone reporter at The Verge would try to find another angle, or there would be another angle. I mean, drone news is moving very fast. There's always a headline every other week. So we try that and re-embed the same chart and direct users to the same data repo that we have.
That's great. And Jen, is that a similar kind of process with the trends work that you do? Is it more of a manual process of going back and updating a visualization?
It's unfortunately a little bit manual for us. We're often adding in additional rows into a spreadsheet, usually a CSV, and then uploading those onto GitHub or to match whatever HTML file or visualization we're using. So it can often be a manual process, but for us it's very important, especially as the story progresses, to make sure that we are staying constant with real-world events.
That's great. And hopefully, like in our next session next Thursday, we'll have a little bit more time to kind of tease some of these questions out. Unfortunately, we're out of time today. But Jen, where can people go to find out more information about trends? And we're talking a little bit about the GitHub page. Maybe we could just let people know what that URL is again.
Yeah. So there are a couple different outlets you can go to. If you just want to get a sense of the different types of trends that our News Lab team is working on, you can check us out on twitter.com/Google Trends. You can also go directly to Google Trends to do some exploring yourself. That's just at google.com/trends. There are also lessons on g.co/newslab, which will walk you through a lot of the different nuances for our Google Trends website. Our previous office hours are also now on YouTube on our Google News Lab channel. And next week, definitely tune in. We'll have one more office hours for Google Trends, which will allow anyone to just kind of ask any questions that might have came up over the last 3 weeks.
That's great. And Frank, where can folks find out more about the work that you do and kind of track the progress that you're doing as you're creating these data visualizations?
Sure, check out theverge.com. The website. I work a lot on the long forms program. A lot of the visualizations appear on there, and that's a long form program. It has a tab on theverge.com, and we have a long form every week, usually every Wednesday. So.
That's great. And if anybody's interested in getting more training in their newsroom or in person around these tools, you can check out more information about our U.S. Trainers Network, which is on our g.co/newslab site under programs. You can actually request somebody like Frank to come in and actually do a training on these amazing tools. We're always also looking for other opportunities to provide additional training or insight around how to use our tools. Also, just again, wanted to refresh you guys with our website, g.co/newslab. As Jen mentioned, lots of training materials on there. Tune in next week on Thursday at 7:30 a.m. where Jen will be yet again waking up bright and early to do one of these for us. And we just want to thank Jen again for the amazing help that she's been providing. If anyone has any questions, you can always reach out to us via our website, via our social media channels, or even just drop a question into the comments section of one of these videos. We'll come back and answer those in next week's session, which is more of an open Q&A. So definitely check that out, and thanks a lot for tuning in. We'll see you all next week.
Thanks.
Bye.